Hello, welcome to another episode of the Virtual Ninja Show. Today I have two experts with me as we are going to talk about Defender for Identity and the various response actions. And I start with Chris. Chris, please introduce yourself.
Hey everyone, my name's Chris. I'm from the Defender Customer Experience team here at Microsoft. I'm part of the engineering team in Microsoft Defender for Identity.
Thank you, Chris. And then we have Daniel. Daniel, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. My name is Dan Lynch. I am the product marketing manager for MDI. And again, just really excited to be here with you and Chris to talk about ITDR.
So thanks, Daniel. Before we actually go and look at the various response actions, can you help us a little bit understand why identity again is very important and what are the different products and tools that we have to protect identities and how all of that fits into our Defender XDR story?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And, I think it's really important to just kind of level set in how we as Microsoft really define ITDR. And we've seen just in all of the discussions with customers that it really is that overlap between identity and access management and extended detection response. And, we've brought together our solutions, which are Entra and Defender XDR. And we're going to talk a lot about this in the response action, but there's elements of IAM response, right? Actually disrupting and blocking or re-authenticating a user to disrupt an in-progress attack. And then there's also elements of like remediation, right? Understanding, being able to correlate all of the different activities or, malicious things that an attacker might have done and really start to remediate those. So I just want to level set and make sure we're all on the same page that ITDR really spans both of these areas. And it's important to make sure that the solutions you have, the teams that are in place there are really able to collaborate and work powerfully together. Just a little bit of a pitch on MDI and how we fit in, right? It is a core element of Defender XDR. It's where we look at the identity specific alerts and information within the platform. And then, as I said, really start to correlate those with all the different domains, knowing just how advanced attackers have become and, the ways that they're jumping from different domains. So being able to see how those come together in a true incident is really powerful.
Yeah. And, and identities, they live in Entra ID or on-prem. And so it's so important to have that connection and integration, the tight integration to then bring that ITDR to life. So I think let's go a little bit deeper into that connection, Chris. So I think we have a lot of opportunities and options available within the product. If there is an identity compromise, you can do various things with that user, which we call response actions. So there is a few response actions that we have right there in the product. And then we also go and look into what you can customize. But first, bring us there, Chris.
Thanks, Heike. So we want to cover sort of three broad areas today, and we're going to go a little bit deeper into each of these areas. But firstly, we have within our Defender XDR product specific response actions that we can trigger from a manual perspective. So if you're investigating an incident, you can trigger to disable a user, you can mark a user as compromised, and then we can go a little bit further and actually have a sort of policy-driven approach as well, whereby we will create a query that we can run, and then off the back of the query, we can trigger an automated response action with that. I then want to go a little bit deeper in terms of what Daniel was talking about with the Entra and XDR integration as well, because with Entra, we have this really great capability with conditional access. Hopefully everyone's familiar with conditional access and what you can do with it. And what we can do with our XDR platform is we have a very tight integration there, whereby we can trigger one of these response actions or indeed through the custom detection or the policy-driven approach. And we can mark a user as compromised. And when we mark a user as compromised, what happens is that triggers a flow where the entity in Entra gets marked as high risk, and then we can apply specific conditional access policies onto that user based on the user's risk level. And we can do things like block, we can do things like enforce MFA, we can even do things like MFA strength as well. That's not just for on-prem, by the way, and on-prem apps, but it's for cloud apps. It's for any app. And we can do that through our integration with Entra federated apps, or we can do it with Entra private access also. And then we'll wrap up with a little bit of the future, where we go in from an attack perspective and how do we respond to those attacks. And that's where attack disruption is really key.
Thanks, Chris. And I would suggest that let's jump into a demo and have a look at how all these things look like in an environment.
Perfect. Let's do that. The first thing I want to show is from a technology we have in our XDR platform, that from an incident, we can go and trigger one of those manual response actions. And I'll show you what they are. So just in the incidents queue we have here, if I flick into this top incident, which I have here. So once the incident's loaded up here, we can see that this is a multi-stage incident. I'll just give myself a little bit more real estate there. It's a multi-stage incident. There's lots going on in here. We're not going to investigate this incident a deep dive today. But what I want to show you is how manual response actions are integrated directly into the incident console itself. So within here, we have a number of users which are potentially at risk as part of this incident. And I can click and see some users here. We can see the Steve user in particular. And I know Steve is the one that's actually at risk as part of this. And if I click Steve, when the user page loads here in the middle, what we will see is an overview of Steve. We can see that he's actually got some Entra risk already. We can see a bit more information about Steve. But the important thing here is if I click on the 3 dots, I get all of these response actions available to me directly from the incident page, the incident summary page here.
I have a question on that immediately right now, Chris. Is this dependent also on what products you have? Like, will this list be shorter or longer, or will it be always long, but then grayed out? Is it also dependent on the permissions you have? Is it still available to click, but then you get an arrow? How is that user interface?
Yeah, so absolutely. It depends what products you have deployed and what permissions you have as well. So those things might be scope dependent on those 2 things there. So as an example, Defender for Identity is our on-premises product, and we deployed the sensor onto the domain controller. That gives us options such as disabling the user in Active Directory or forcing a password reset. The confirm user compromise that I mentioned already, if I was to click that now, what would happen is it would go to Entra and it would mark the user as high risk in Entra, which then allows us to trigger some sort of conditional access policy to go with that. And then also, in addition to that, we have all of these other options available to us. This is actually from our CASB solution or Defender for Cloud App solution, whereby we can do things like see all of the user's activity. So that they're less of a response action, but still relevant in terms of the XDR as a full capability. Of course, if the user is just a cloud user and only in the cloud, I can suspend the user in Entra if I wanted to as well.
Okay, but the options wouldn't be there if I wouldn't have deployed the sensor, for instance, as you explained, on a domain controller on premises.
Exactly. And then all the permissions could be scoped as well. So we have a unified RBAC model where we can restrict some of these response actions if we want to also. Just to sort of reiterate on this as well, what we've tried to do with our XDR solution holistically is make all of these experiences really available across different surfaces within the UI. So I've just shown you one way to go in and trigger those response actions. I could also go into the assets tab here and I could dig into the user details there, trigger it that way. I could search for the user and do it that way. There's many different ways to get to that same surface, and it's all about efficiency. Like, how can we make a security analyst more efficient during their investigation?
So there is 2 options. There is disable user and enable user. So how do I know if the user is already disabled so I could enable the user back again? Or where do I find this information? Would this be in Active Directory, or is this also somewhere in the portal for me?
So it is in Active Directory. So if you disable the user, then that would be represented in Active Directory as the user being disabled. Probably the best way to see it is if you trigger an action, you can go into the Actions and Submissions Center, and then in there you can get an overview of that action and you can see the current state of the user. So if the user is disabled, you can re-enable them from there, or you can reverse that action as well.
Yeah, and I'd love to jump in and add a little bit to that too. I think the biggest piece that I really want to stress here is the options you see. Yes, it's going to be based on your permissions and what you're scoped to be able to do within your role, but The real magic here is that integration with the identity and access management space. So if the user is on-prem, Chris mentioned the sensors that we have directly on your identity infrastructure on-prem via MDI. And we can directly mark a user as compromised, take action there. But even in the cloud, right? Entra ID comes in and we can actively mark a user as compromised right from the SOC portal. That information is going to flow natively into the Entra ID portal where your identity teams work. So I think it's just really powerful that your options there are going to be based on where that identity lives in your unique identity landscape. And then, to Chris's point, there's a lot of stuff happening in this incident, and there's a ton of different alerts from different domains being correlated. You can see Copilot was working on the side here to build out that incident report. And if we scroll down a little bit, there should be some recommendations right from Copilot on actions that should be taken. So it's not just we're leaving you to your own devices. You have to select the right option there. Copilot is bringing in that extra intelligence to say, hey, based on what's happened in this incident, based on, the most recent telemetry, here's some steps you might want to take to make sure, you disrupt any type of attack or you're fully protected.
Thank you. That brings me to another question, because I see that, of course, we talked about that you can disable a user on-prem. You can also disable a user in Entra ID. Mm-hmm. If that is connected, will it do the same in the other one? You know what I mean?
This is a great question. So typically, Active Directory in customer environments is the source of authority. What that means is that the changes that are made there, they're like the primary changes, so to speak, and they get pushed or replicated up or synchronized into Entra as the cloud identity provider. So if you disable a user on premises with the MDI capability, that will sync up. Now, there is a slight delay in that, or there can be a delay in that of, maybe 20, 30 minutes based on the Entra sync cycle. Mm-hmm. So that's just something to be aware of, but that doesn't prevent you from triggering the response action to do the disable in Active Directory and then trigger to suspend the user in Entra at the same time. You could do that, and then that would make sure that the cloud-related applications and the on-prem applications would be prevented.
Yeah. I think it makes sense, right? Because you always, if there's a sync, you have some delay. So if it's a compromised user, hit the button to also disable it in Entra ID, and then you are on the quicker, safer way.
Yeah. One point I'll just quickly add as well, if I may, on the disable user action in particular. One thing to bear in mind is disabling a user is going to prevent any new, let's call it token issuance from that point forwards. And that's pretty critical, because if that user is compromised and they've got a ticket granting ticket in Active Directory, so they've authenticated, that ticket could be valid for 10 hours. Now, if they want to go and connect to another service, they would go and get a service ticket from Active Directory. And if the account's disabled, that's what we're blocking. We're blocking that future access to new services. So we do that obviously with the on-prem scenario, and we can do that in Entra. The tokens are different, but the concept is the same.
But I think there's other response actions that could help us with that scenario, or like there's ask for a password reset. When is that happening? Now, later, next time the user signs in. So what are some options that you can do to prevent the moving to something different with the same user?
Yeah, so the force password reset option does exactly that, Heike. It will go and set the user's account to change password at next login from an on-prem Active Directory perspective. And then when they next log in, they would need to know the current password and then reset. Now, typically an attacker might not have that clear text password. They would probably have some derivation of the password, like the hash or some other credential or even a ticket, which obviously they wouldn't be able to use that to reset the password. So that's a good control. From a cloud perspective, we do also have, and it's worth showing now, we do also have this require user to sign in again option here. What that will do is it will go to Entra and it will tell Entra to invalidate all of the tokens that Entra has issued for that user. So that will allow cloud applications or applications that are being authenticated through Entra to have a more immediate response in terms of preventing access to our apps. We can't do that from an on-prem perspective necessarily. It's a little bit more complex and complicated, to be honest with you, like trying to invalidate Kerberos tickets. But, that's something that's, something for us to think about, I guess, more broadly.
So if I could jump in again and keep pestering Chris as I like to do, I think like the real magic here is wherever that identity sits, we're giving the SOC the tools to, highlight that this user is compromised. Something has happened here and we need to disrupt, which I think is really the next piece. We're going to get into a little bit of like the response actions themselves, but that disruption is the first piece of a response action. How do we stop an attack that is in motion or active at this moment? And what we're showing here are really those disruption capabilities that span identities in the cloud, identities on-prem, really whatever environment they live in.
Thanks, Daniel, for chiming in here. Chris, so those have all been now manual response actions based on you see something and now you want to respond. I know that there's also an option, you mentioned this on your agenda slide, to automate some of these things. So something, and now you want to have the system respond automatically. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll go to the hunting capability we have within Defender XDR. Those that aren't familiar with hunting, it's our platform. We can write all sorts of queries. We can dive into the data, into the telemetry. There's a real richness of information within the platform that we can use to, discover information within the service, either from the identity platform as we are today, or even from the endpoint platform. But what we can do, which is the interesting bit for what we want to talk about, is we can actually go and create what's called a custom detection. And with a custom detection, we can actually fire off one of those response actions in a sort of automated fashion off the back of it. So it's really quite powerful. I've got, a very simple query here just to sort of show the power of it. Your queries could be absolutely more in depth. They could be looking at, many other things, whether it's the alerts, whether it's identity logon telemetry, whether it's things that's happening in the directory. There's all sorts of information we can dig into and surface here to drive the detection. This specific detection, very, very simple. I'm just looking at alerts where an alert is a identity theft alert. I passed the ticket. So pass the ticket is a type of lateral movement issue whereby an attacker can dump out a Kerberos ticket and then use that to move onto a different machine. So this is, a suspicious alert. It's something that if the user has been subject to a pass the ticket, we might want to trigger one of those actions off the back of it. So in this instance here, we have the pass the ticket alert. I'm just finding that, and then I'm finding all of the details about the user from that alert. So I won't dig into all of the specifics of the hunting query here, but if I run this query, what I should get is a response here where I can see that I've got a pass the ticket alert for Steve, and I've got some unique identifiers that have been returned in the query for Steve. Now, this is important because these unique identifiers are what allows us to then go and trigger one of those custom detections and response actions.
Mm-hmm. And now you can save that query, or how do you? Oh, there's a manage. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can do many things here. I can save the query, which I actually have in this instance. So I can save it not only for myself, but I can save it for other people that are within my tenant, which is really interesting because if you've got a group of analysts and you want to share those queries between the analysts, it's really straightforward to do. I'll just show you that actually. If I click on there, I can say save it to my queries or save it to a shared query. That's very straightforward for me to do that. The other thing I can do here is I can create what's called a custom detection. Now, in this particular tenant, we actually have the unified security operations experience. So I can create an analytics rule as well, which is something that's slightly different related to Sentinel. But actually, what we're going to do is we're going to create one of these custom detections here. So I just need to fill in a little bit of information here. So what I'll do is I'll just say mark user as compromised for PTT, which is pass the ticket. We have a frequency we have to run this on. So I can set that to a frequency there. I provide a title here. I'll just give it the same as the detection name just for simplicity. I can give it a severity. I'll give this a medium severity here. And this would be a lateral movement category. I think that lines up well. And then here, just write a description, which would be kick off, confirm user compromised, and click next. We've got our user entities, which was returned in the query. I want to identify that user based on probably the account SID is a good one to use. And then this is the important bit here. Based on that query, what I can do is I can trigger one of these actions here. And these are the actions we've just spoken about, right? So I can mark the user as compromised, or I can go to Active Directory and disable the user, or I can force password reset. So if I mark the user as compromised, I can see this account object ID, which is one of those unique attributes that I returned. Entra is going to use that to find the user within Entra and then go and mark that user as high risk. So if I click next and save this, which I won't in this tenant, but if I was to save this, what would happen is every time that query that you saw that I'd written returns a result, when it returns the result, it's going to fire off this custom detection, and then it's going to go and mark that user, the returned user, as compromised, and then whatever conditional access policies we want would kick off in that instance.
I was always such a big fan of conditional access because it's so powerful. Like when I started, it was all about Defender for Endpoint, and we had alerts on a device, and the device was suddenly a high risk device, and integration, conditional access, Intune, and the device wasn't allowed, like the user with the device wasn't allowed to access corporate information anymore. So this is same, right? It's so powerful what you can do. And this is also, I think, maybe is this a good time to talk about the multi-factor authentication that you now can then kick in with that compromised user?
Yeah, definitely. What I would say is that typically with the customers that we speak to, the notion of policy configuration for access policy, MFA deployment, MFA registration, all the things to do with how MFA and credentials are provisioned and used within the customer's estate are typically done by the identity and access management team within the customer. That's something that sits wholly and squarely with IAM administrators. So what we're trying to do here is, we don't want to replicate all of that same policy into our security operations platform. We just want to bring the two things together in a natural way where our security analysts get to influence how that policy is applied, but the policy application and governance of the policy still sits with those identity and access administrators. So with that mark user as compromised is a real great way, as you just explained, Heike, that brings that together. So if I flick over to the Entra portal here, I've just got open here a conditional access policy to show you what one looks like and show you what types of options we have. So within here, for this particular conditional access policy, I can go in and I can apply it to a specific group of users if I want, all users. So in this particular instance, I'm applying it to all users within the tenants. I can also exclude users as well, or I can have different groups, etc.
Don't lock yourself out.
Don't lock yourself out. Definitely don't lock yourself out. Which is quite nice that we actually give you that visibility there, right? To make sure that you're not going to configure a policy that's...
Should be red and bigger. Yes.
And now this is an interesting one here. Most people will probably be aware already, because Entra is not something that's new, that Entra supports all of your cloud applications, right? So we have Microsoft first-party applications, Microsoft 365, Microsoft Dynamics, etc. We have custom applications, which could be using OpenID or SAML. We have SaaS applications that could be federated back to Entra. Of course, we can apply conditional access to all of those applications, and that's sort of bread and butter for most IAM administrators. What's new, and I think what's really relevant for us in this story today, is we can now extend that back to on-premises applications, whether that's an application that's using some on-prem protocol, whether it's SMB, whether it's RDP, or in the case of a domain controller, it could be something like PowerShell, WinRM connections to a domain controller, which is like a management protocol. So if you configure your Entra private access applications, the way that the applications are represented in Entra, the application definition, so to speak, is the same as all of the other cloud applications. So if I apply this policy to all cloud applications. If I have private access deployed, that would include all of those on-prem apps as well. So when I apply that there, that's going to cover all applications. I think that's, a real benefit to this being within the identity and access management portal. We can cover, all of those applications. Then we have the conditions, and I think you mentioned this already about the sort of device platforms and so on. We have numerous different conditions we can apply here. The one that we're interested in this particular instance, is the high risk. So when the user's marked as high risk, and that would be done through that workflow that we mentioned, they would get marked as high, and then this policy would apply to them. So whatever the grant controls are for this policy, they would come through for that user as they're authenticating.
And just to jump in really quickly, to tie that back to kind of the marked user as compromised, as soon as that user is marked as compromised within Defender XDR, it will bump it up to high risk. So that's where kind of the magic of that integration really hits is, okay, as soon as the SOC says this individual, this identity has been compromised, it's going to automatically trigger all of these policies for whatever application they're trying to access. And with private access, that now extends on-prem.
Okay, thank you.
So just to wrap it up then, in terms of what we can do with that policy, what are the actual controls we can apply? So if I click on these grant controls here, I have numerous different things that I can actually do to that user's session. So I can block the user's access. And again, that would extend to those on-prem apps, as we discussed, or the cloud applications. Or I can grant the access, but then require some sort of additional things to apply to that session. So I can require MFA, of course, and then that's fully integrated with the Entra MFA service. It would use the Authenticator app or whatever you've got configured, and it would ping the user. I can also require authentication strength. And this is something, again, which is really powerful for us in Microsoft, is we can actually do things like phish-resistant MFA or passwordless MFA. So if you're thinking about creating this sort of policy, whether it's in response to confirm user compromise or just a general policy for like domain controller access, we can actually start to do things like require FIDO keys. And that's really, really powerful for us as well.
Wow.
And then there's some other controls here that I won't necessarily dig into. But the important ones are around the MFA. That's from a security perspective. They're the things that we really want to focus on, the block and the MFA controls.
Wow, Chris, this was a lot of information. Can you help us summarize this a little bit, and then also bring us to what are we doing when it comes to automation? Yeah,
sure. And I think it's interesting for us to understand the different ways that we can respond and what the capabilities and effectiveness of those response actions are. So I've got a slide here just to sort of talk through that. So on this axis here, we can see, what would be our false positive ratio, and then the effectiveness of how quickly that response action can be triggered. So firstly, we've got prevent actions, right? So that would be things like, mail policies that are blocking malicious emails, or AV policy, etc. Typically, they're very low from a false positive ratio. They're very effective. And they're very quick or early in the attack time frame, but also they're not necessarily going to catch everything, right? We then have, what we would refer to as block actions. So here are things like behavioral monitoring within the EDR platform, or conditional access would be considered part of a block action. So it's something that, is maybe a slightly higher from a false positive ratio perspective, because it's a little bit more heuristic in terms of how it works. And it comes a little bit further down the sort of attack chain there as well. We then have those automated response actions, and that's sort of those custom detections or other sort of SOAR playbooks that you might have configured in your organization. So these really require a good balance in terms of how they've been configured. If they're too aggressive, they can have a really significant business impact. If they're not aggressive enough, then the security value could be low. So with them being too aggressive, the FP ratio could be really high. And generally, these are after an attack has started to play out, right? So we've already got the detection, we've already got the alert, maybe the incident's played out. And by that time, you're further down the attack time frame. And then lastly, we have, that manual response action, very, very high fidelity. For me to go in as an analyst and actually investigate an incident from a human perspective, I know that user is compromised and I can trigger that response action. So it's very, very high fidelity. But it is, again, typically a little bit slower because we're waiting for that incident to play out. And, we've sort of spoken about these different types of actions that we have already. And I think really where Microsoft see the future in terms of how we respond is in a technology we have called attack disruption. And attack disruption is really a very, very high fidelity AI powered way to go and not just respond to attacks, but disrupt them as they are playing out. And that's really key to understand. We're not waiting for an incident to fully play out before we then trigger a response action. We're actually intervening as the incident is playing out live. And we have various different actions that are triggered as part of attack disruption. And we trigger it based on a very, very high signal to noise ratio. I think it's like 99.9% SNR in terms of when these things are triggered. So we're like uber confident that that's, a real life attack. And when we trigger that action, then, we're sure that it's a true positive and we're disrupting it before it plays out anymore.
Yeah, the Javier just did an episode again with Christos on attack disruption, and we will put the link in here. But I would like to give Daniel as well the chance to bring attack disruption home when it comes to Defender for Identity.
It's always dangerous to just hand me the mic at the end. But, we hinted at it a little bit in the beginning, right? Which is there's two real elements of response. We've got the disruption. We talked about how powerful conditional access is, how we can either manually inflate that risk to force reauthentication or some of those policies to qualify. But there's also all of that great risk analysis that's happening in real time. And to go back to what Chris just presented, right? That prevention, the blocking access before a breach actually occurs, disrupting that attack before any malicious activity happens. What is so cool to me about attack disruption is the fact that it takes that next step. Yes, it's automated, and that's unbelievably powerful to just speed those responses. Like Chris said, we have really high confidence something is happening. Why wait? Let's stop it now. Mm-hmm. But it's where we can start to remediate some of the bad actors' tactics. And Chris is going to roll his eyes because I always go back to the same example around business email compromise, right? It's one thing to say Chris's identity was compromised and he sent a bunch of malicious emails trying to phish others in the organization. It's one thing to stop his access, but can you take that next step and really pull those emails back, stop that attack that's happened, and start to pick up those little dominoes like after the first one fell? And that's what to me is so cool about attack disruption is it's not just a disruption. It's also the start of remediation. And yes, bringing the human element in to investigate and make sure everything is remediated to the full extent is critical. But stopping those initial dominoes from falling after that first one can have such a massive impact on how far that attack radius actually gets.
You were saying rolling the eyes. I get goosebumps when you talk so excited about attack disruption. And I'm with you. And for everyone out there, it's on by default. So there's nothing to configure. And of course, depending on the Defender products you have installed and running, various attack disruption scenarios will then kick in for you. And hopefully you never see it, but you are protected against those. So that was amazing. I think we covered a lot. And thank you so much, Chris and Daniel, for being my experts on today's show. I hope everyone out there enjoyed the show as much as I did. And talk soon. Bye.